Alright, so we're going to do our third and final section now in our chapter on the digestive and urinary system, wrap up the urinary system, and then that will be the end of this chapter. And so what we're looking at now in the rest of this chapter is what can go wrong with the urinary system and also some of the fixes that might need to occur as a result of some of these conditions. So renal failure occurs as kind of a generic term that we use when you have a complete stopping of filtration of blood. So if the kidneys fail to function, if they stop filtering things out of the blood, that would be just kind of generally what you would describe as renal failure. So this could be an acute situation, meaning it could occur over like a relatively short period of time, sort of like a once only sort of a thing, one time only sort of a thing. Or it could be a chronic condition if the kidneys are in long-term disrepair, if their overall function is declining to the point where they stop doing any filtration whatsoever, then that would be more of a chronic condition. The consequences, since we know now what the kidneys do for us, what the renal system does for us, we can also kind of think about what sorts of bad things might result in terms of what occurs with the renal failure. So one of the things the kidneys do for us is they help regulate blood pH. And so if all of a sudden we can no longer get excess H pluses or bicarbonate out of the blood, then we're going to run into a situation where acidosis might occur. You could have the result of anemia occurring also. You could have swelling or edema, so if you consume water and you don't have the ability to get the excess fluid out of your body, that fluid has to go somewhere, so that we're going to be talking about some swelling or edema as a result. Along with that, also we have hypertension, because if blood volume is too high, then blood pressure is going to be high as well. You're going to be pumping more blood through the same size space, and so overall the force of that, or the pressure of that, is going to go up. We could also have a buildup of urea in the blood. Any kind of nitrogen-containing waste, if they're not expelled from the body, are also going to build up in the blood, and that can also become very, very serious. So in terms of how we would go about fixing that, or not fixing it, but coping with it, I guess you could say, you can have various artificial devices like what you call artificial kidneys or dialysis machines to clean the blood. We could also have what's called continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, which sounds really fancy, but what that's talking about is where you actually use your own peritoneal membrane as a filtration membrane. So you're not actually using the kidneys, you're using your own peritoneum membrane or connective tissue as a sort of filter for itself. Hemodialysis is more of you're sort of confined to one location, whereas the second one, the continuous type, is more of an ambulatory situation. Ambulatory just means you can walk around, right? You're not tied down, you're not fixed to a bed. You can walk around with the device, and it will continue to carry out dialysis for you. Hemodialysis, you would actually have to go in for treatment and sort of sit there and rest while the dialysis machine takes care of the filtration of your blood, because again, the kidneys aren't working the way they're supposed to. More long-term solution would be kidney transplantation. Of course, there's always issues associated with that, finding a donor, ensuring that it's a good match, ensuring that it's not going to be rejected by the body. So it's a definite long-term proposition when you start thinking about transplant of any organ, but of course kidneys are an option there as well. So this is kind of the idea of what a hemodialysis setup would look like. We actually have the mechanism here. We're going to be drawing blood out of the body, and so it's going to be going through a pump that's pulling it out of the body through the hemodialyzer, which is going to bring in arterial blood here. So arterial blood is the blood coming in from the tube. As the blood passes through this mechanism, there's going to be an option here for any sort of solute to come out of the blood. So the blood passes through all of these various chambers and side chambers, and all along the way, there's a lot of surface area inside of here. Any sort of waste or excess molecules can then be pulled out of the blood. So this is going to set up a concentration gradient for things like excess ions, H pluses especially, for things like nitrogenous waste. Those sorts of things can be pulled out of the blood, and now the freshly filtered or cleansed blood is going to be pumped back into the body as well. So at the bottom of this mechanism, we have a tube returning blood back into circulation, and so it's acting as a filter outside the body to remove any solutes from the blood itself. All right, so that's just sort of showing what would occur if you had a donor situation where you have a donor kidney and therefore also a donor ureter to connect the kidney to the bladder, and then from the bladder, of course, it's on out through the urethra. As far as urination, this is now emptying of the bladder, and again, this has, like we talked about previously in a section on defecation, there's both an involuntary and a voluntary component to this. Of course, you do have control when and where you urinate. Fortunately for us, we do have that control, but the actual processing of urine out of the body takes place as a result of smooth muscle contraction, of which you have no control. So the initial sort of allowing yourself to go in the first place is the result of skeletal muscles closing or not. And then once that is no longer an issue, smooth muscles are going to help empty the urine on out of the body. We do have kind of the same setup again. We talked previously about sphincter muscles. These are smooth muscles which allow for the closure of certain parts of the body in certain situations. There is smooth muscle internally as part of a urethral sphincter, and then the outer external urethral sphincter is a result of skeletal muscle. So the outer ring of muscle is voluntarily controlled, whereas the inner ring of muscle is more of an involuntary control with that smooth muscle. All right, so we have now kind of the progression of urination here, where we have the bladder filling up with urine. That's going to cause stretch receptors to activate, sending a message to the lower part of the spinal cord that yes, indeed, the bladder is filling up. Here in step 2, we have impulses coming back now from the spinal column to the bladder, telling now the internal sphincter muscles to relax. And when those internal sphincter muscles relax, that's going to cause the urine to be able to leave the bladder. From there, we now have impulses traveling to the brain, where you now actually realize that you have to go. It's one thing for the bladder to actually be full for itself. It's another thing for your brain to consciously realize that the bladder is full. And so the ascending path to the brain is also involved here, telling you that you do indeed need to go. Step 4 here has timing, right? So when timing is appropriate, and that's very critical, right? We can now have voluntary relaxation of the external urethral sphincter, which is going to allow for urine to leave from the bladder and go on out of the body. And that's what happens there in step number 5. Stop. So the dogs are a big fan of the urinary system too, apparently. They're chiming in with their own little input. The last little section here is on urinary tract infections. This is where we now have microorganisms that are part of the urinary system. They can enter into the urethra, either from the rectum, from your own body, particularly in females, or in the form of STDs as well. As I said, these do tend to be a bit more common in women. The results of this are any sort of infection is going to create some of the same things, fever especially. If it's an extended case of a UTI, you could also have blood in the urine. You could also have painful or more frequent urination as well. Relatively easy to treat these, and it's very important to do this as quickly as possible, because if the lower UTI is not treated, then the infection can actually make its way up into the kidneys, and then you're dealing with a renal infection, which is potentially much more serious and also more difficult to treat. So you always want to catch this and treat it before it has a chance to spread up into the upper parts of the urinary system. So that's all we're going to do in this chapter. We're going to close this up, and we'll start with the next section.